Miriam did not cry when it happened. That was the part nobody understood later, when she told the story to the people she trusted enough to tell it to. They expected tears, or at least the particular tightness around the eyes that shows a person barely holding themselves together. They imagined her pushing back her chair, or going very still in the way some women go still right before they say something that ends things cleanly. But Miriam had spent the better part of her life learning that certain moments demand a kind of internal silence that looks, from the outside, like nothing is happening at all. So she reached for her water glass, wrapped her fingers around the cool stem of it to feel something solid, and kept her face exactly where it needed to be. She had been sitting at that dinner table for 2 hours by the time it happened. 2 hours of being the quietest person in a loud and self-satisfied room. This was not new to her. She had been doing it her entire life, fitting herself into whatever space remained after everyone else had claimed theirs. She had become very skilled at it. Skilled enough that she could sit at a dinner table for 2 full hours and contribute to conversations and laugh at the right moments and be present for every exchange without anyone at the table particularly registering that she was there. The restaurant was not the kind of place she would have chosen. Too bright, too deliberate. The menus had no prices listed, which always gave her a faint feeling of being tested. The silverware was heavy in the way that signals expense before anything has been eaten. The tablecloths were white in the particular fashion of rooms that want you to understand how much everything costs, and the candles were not there for warmth but for the same reason, and the message was being received clearly by everyone at the table except Miriam, who had spent the first 40 minutes thinking about the tea she would make when she got home. About the blue mug on her kitchen shelf. About the plant on the windowsill she had been bringing back from the edge of dying for the past 2 months. About the apartment, quiet and entirely hers, and how much she wanted to be in it. Darian had booked the restaurant weeks in advance. He had mentioned it twice in conversation, both times with the casual but deliberate emphasis of someone waiting to see a particular reaction. She had said it sounded wonderful and had produced the correct reaction without difficulty, because she had spent 14 months learning to enter his world gracefully. She understood what the evening was. A performance. She was part of the set. Darian sat at the long table in the position he always located in any room he entered. Not the obvious position, not the host end, but the one that made the most people naturally turn toward him when they spoke. She had watched him find this position at dinner parties, at company events, at casual Sunday gatherings where the host was genuinely more powerful than him. He moved through rooms the way water finds its level, without visible effort, without apparent intention, as though the room had been designed in advance to accommodate him. This had seemed magnetic to her once, in the early months. She could still see the quality. She simply could no longer separate it from what it cost the people in the orbit of it. He was 35 years old and had the specific confidence of a man who had been told he was exceptional early enough that the belief had set like concrete. Not arrogant in the recognizable way. Real arrogance requires some awareness of a gap between how you see yourself and how the world sees you. Darian had no such gap. He inhabited his own certainty the way you inhabit a house you were born in, without examining the walls or wondering who lived there before you. He was warm, in the way of practiced people, which is to say the warmth was real but it was also precisely calibrated to serve his comfort rather than yours. She had been dazzled by him at the beginning. On their first date she had watched him hold a conversation with a stranger at the bar for 8 minutes and leave the man laughing and grateful and visibly warmed. She had thought, watching it, that here was a man who had the gift of making people feel seen. She had wanted to be near that. She had not understood yet that there was a meaningful difference between a man who made people feel seen and a man who made himself feel important by keeping other people at carefully managed distances. That the quality she had taken for warmth was a skill, and that skills can be turned on and off, and that there are people in the world whose skills are turned on for every person in the room except the one who needs it most. His colleague across the table was named Greg. Mid-40s, broadly built, with the unhurried ease of a man who had stopped requiring other people's approval somewhere in his late 30s and had not missed it. He asked questions the way some people throw things, not always aiming carefully, simply curious to see where they landed. He leaned forward with his wine glass and asked Darian how the regional expansion project had begun. How the idea had taken its first shape. Darian answered at considerable length. He was very good at this particular kind of narration, the kind that reconstructs a sequence of ordinary business decisions as a story about a person with uncommon foresight. He named the moment he had seen the opportunity nobody else had seen. He described the resistance he had faced and how he had moved through it with patience and strategic thinking. He used the word instinct. He used the word leadership. The table listened with the quality of attention that people naturally give to someone who is clearly practiced at being listened to. Miriam listened too. She had written those proposals. All 5 of them, across 3 months. Darian would arrive home from work with his thinking moving too fast for his words, unable to sit, pacing through the apartment while he talked through the shape of what he needed to say. She would sit at the kitchen table with her laptop and ask the questions that organized his thinking without making him feel like he needed organizing, because she understood his pride precisely and had decided, without realizing she was deciding, that protecting it was more important than having her own name on anything. She had written the sentences he could not quite arrive at. She had caught 3 errors in the final draft, the kind that would have produced real and lasting embarrassment in front of the exact people now listening to his account. She had corrected them quietly at midnight and sent the clean version to his email. He had replied with 1 word. She had gone to sleep feeling pleased about that word and had not yet examined how little the word contained. Greg finished nodding at the end of Darian's account and turned to Miriam with the easy and inclusive curiosity of a man who brought everyone in the room into a conversation as a matter of habit. He set down his wine glass and said, pleasantly, "And you? What is it you do?" Before Miriam drew a full breath, before her voice had any chance of entering the room at all, Darian glanced at her. It was not a real look. It lasted less than a second. It had the quality of awareness you give to a piece of furniture, brief and without engagement, present and gone simultaneously. And with the complete ease of a man stating something he has never once had reason to examine, he said, "She is nobody important. Just someone I am seeing." He turned back to Greg and continued talking. The table did not stop. Not for a single moment. The conversation moved on the way conversations do in rooms where people are enjoying themselves and have no particular reason to pay attention to anything small and quietly devastating. Someone at the far end said something that drew laughter, and the laughter rose and moved through the room and covered everything with the complete efficiency of a sound designed to cover things. Greg nodded at something Darian said. The wine kept moving. The candles burned down evenly. Miriam kept her hand around the water glass. She breathed in. She breathed out. She gave herself 3 seconds. This was something she had learned to do years before Darian, during an earlier period of her life when she had needed to recover in public and had taught herself the minimum time required. 3 seconds with her eyes on the tablecloth, and then she lifted her face and placed it back where it needed to be. Calm. Present. Untroubled. The face of a woman who had no difficulty being exactly where she was. Not a single person at the table looked at her for the rest of the evening. She was 31 years old. She had paid for her own university education while working 2 jobs in her final year because her family had run out of money and she had not wanted to ask anyone for help. She had built a career in a field that did not reward people who did not advocate loudly for themselves, which meant she had been producing more than she had been given credit for since nearly the start. She mentored a younger colleague named Lucy on Tuesday lunchtimes and gave her the honest answers that were genuinely hard to find. She had learned to cook properly during a difficult period in her late 20s and made a chicken soup her oldest friend Diane called the best thing she had ever eaten. She had walked alone through 3 cities in 3 different countries because she loved the feeling of a place before she had decided what to think of it. She spoke 2 languages with confidence and was working steadily on a 3rd. She had a laugh her mother said could fill any room, though she had mostly stopped using it at full volume sometime in the months since she had started arranging her life around Darian. Nobody important. She ate enough of the pasta she had not wanted to order that nobody would notice she had barely eaten. She asked a polite question when the conversation turned briefly in her direction, once, received a polite answer, and watched the conversation move on. She smiled at the right moments. She had been practicing the right moments for years. Darian paid the bill with the ease of someone accustomed to paying bills of this kind in restaurants of this type. He helped her with her coat the way he always did, his hands on her shoulders for exactly the duration of a learned gesture, practiced and impersonal simultaneously. He said his goodbyes with the warmth he reserved for people he found useful, handshakes that lasted slightly longer than necessary, the kind of ending that made people feel well disposed toward him for days afterward. He held the door. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp. She breathed it in and thought about her apartment. The blue mug. The plant on the windowsill. The particular piece of being in a space that required nothing of her. Then Darian took her hand and walked her to the car, already talking about someone at the table who had made an impression, and she walked beside him in the cold night air and said yes at the right moments, and the city went past them with its ordinary sounds, and she kept herself very still inside, the way you are still when you are carrying something that is not yet finished breaking. The drive home took 40 minutes. For the first 20 of them, Darian talked about the evening the way he always talked about evenings that had gone well for him, with the relaxed forward movement of someone reviewing a performance they are satisfied with. He talked about Greg and what Greg's involvement in the coming quarter might mean. He talked about the woman at the far end of the table whose name connected to someone from an earlier chapter of his career. He talked about the wine and whether the restaurant had earned or merely inherited its reputation. He mentioned, twice, things he himself had said that had landed well. Miriam watched the highway. The lights passed at even intervals, orange and steady, appearing and gone, and she watched them the way your eyes follow something rhythmic when your mind is somewhere else entirely. She was not yet angry. She had noticed this, and the absence of anger surprised her a little. What she felt instead was something quieter and more deeply uncomfortable, something that did not have a clean name but felt like being asked to look directly at something she had been carefully not looking at for a long time. He had not mentioned it. He had driven away from the restaurant and reviewed the entire evening, and the 8 words had not come up, because for him they did not exist as something that had happened. They had been said and registered by no one, least of all by him, and the evening had continued, and here they were, 40 minutes from the city, and the words were nowhere in his accounting of the night. She began to take inventory. She thought about the proposals, all 5 of them, with the specific weight of each night attached to the memory. The first one, the night she had stayed up past 1 in the morning because his thinking kept shifting and she kept revising without complaint, because she understood that his mind moved faster than his certainty and she had patience for this. She had patience for almost everything. She had made patience into an entire personality. The second proposal, the night she had noticed a fundamental problem in the framing of the third section and had reworked it entirely from the ground up without telling him, because telling him would have required explaining the problem, and explaining the problem would have felt to him like a criticism of his original thinking, and she had decided somewhere in the routine of those months that protecting his confidence was simply what she did and did not require acknowledgement. Third, fourth, fifth. Each one carrying her thinking, her precision, her late-night attention, in a way that no record would ever reflect. Each one submitted under his name, discussed under his name, credited under his name. She had allowed this to happen. She had made it easy to happen by never naming what she was contributing, by removing her own fingerprints from the work as thoroughly as a person who has decided in advance not to be seen. She had not been selfless. She had told herself she was selfless. That she gave without keeping score, that this was what love looked like when it was healthy, that the women who needed acknowledgement for every contribution were the ones with the fragile sense of self. She had believed this story about herself for 14 months and had not examined whether the story was true or whether it was simply a more comfortable way to describe a ratio. She thought about the Tuesday in October. She had been in full concentration on her own report, the one nobody in his life knew she was developing, built across months in the margins of days that were mostly not her own. She had been in that rare quality of focused thinking, the kind that cannot be forced, that arrives when conditions are exactly right and is cut off completely by interruption. Darian had called. She had answered because she always answered. He had talked for 40 minutes about a workplace conflict that had resolved itself before the call ended. She had helped him organize his feelings about it and find a way through it, and when he hung up the thread she had been following through her own work was completely gone. She had tried to recover it for an hour. She could not. She had stayed up until midnight producing a lesser version of the thinking she had been building. He had never asked about the report. Not that evening, not the next day, not in any of the months since. Because the report existed in a part of her life that he did not know about, because she had never told him about it, because she had decided, without forming the decision consciously, that presenting her own interior life to him was a request too large to make of someone so full of his own. She thought about Diane's birthday. The morning she had cancelled. The gracious and quiet way Diane had said it was fine, knowing it was not fine, loving Miriam enough not to press. She had stood in her kitchen that morning and told herself this was what love required. Putting the other person first. Being present for their needs. But she had not asked herself, not once in 14 months, whether Darian had ever put her first. Whether he had cancelled anything for her. Whether he had rearranged an evening or moved the plan or shown up somewhere early because she needed him there. Whether he had ever inconvenienced himself, even slightly, for her benefit. She knew the answer. She had known it for longer than tonight. She had simply been arranging herself in a position that did not require her to look at it directly. The car pulled into the car park of her building. Darian turned off the engine and the silence was immediate and complete. He looked at her. Full attention, the first real attention he had given her all evening. "You were quiet tonight," he said. "I usually am," she said. He accepted this. He kissed her cheek in the practiced, comfortable way of a man completing an evening correctly. She felt the warmth of it and the distance of it at the same moment. "I will call you tomorrow," he said. "All right," she said. She got out of the car. She heard him start the engine and reverse while she was still 10 steps from the entrance. She did not look back. She went inside, rode the lift to the 3rd floor, unlocked her door, and stood in her hallway with her back against the closed door and her eyes on the ceiling. The apartment was exactly as she had left it. Quiet. Clean. Entirely her own. The plant on the windowsill. The photograph of herself and Diane on the side table, both of them laughing in the full afternoon light of a Portuguese street. The shelf of books she had been reading with attention. The blue mug on the kitchen shelf, in its exact place. She went to the kitchen and made tea. She sat at the table and did not reach for her phone. She thought about the word nobody. She sat with it the way you sit with something whose weight you are still determining. She thought about the specific word just. The way that single syllable compressed everything she was to him into something requiring no further consideration. She was a raw. She was the woman he was currently seeing, which in his telling was a footnote placed after the period of the real sentence of his life. Her phone lit up at 12:40. Good night. 2 words. The correct ending to a satisfactory evening. She placed the phone face down on the table. She sat in the kitchen for a long time after that, listening to the city outside and to herself inside, and what she heard in herself was something that had been waiting a very long time to be listened to. She did not sleep. She moved from the kitchen to her bed around 2 in the morning and lay in the dark and found that the thoughts she had been sitting with downstairs were larger in the quiet, expanded by the absence of everything else she might have occupied herself with. She lay on her back and let them be large. The first thing she came back to was the October phone call. She had been in the precise center of her own thinking, the focused and sustained kind that cannot be manufactured, that arrives on its own schedule and is disrupted easily. She had been in it for nearly an hour, building something careful and specific in the report that was entirely her own. Darian had called. She had answered immediately, before any consideration of whether to answer had time to form, because answering was what she did and the reflex was faster than any thought about it. He had talked for 40 minutes about a conflict at work that had resolved itself by the time the call ended. She had organized his feelings about it. She had reflected his own perspective back to him from a different angle and helped him find a way through. She had done this with genuine care, because she loved him and his problems had always felt like things she wanted to help with. When he hung up, the thread she had been following through her own work was completely cut. She had tried to recover it for an hour. The hour had produced nothing usable. She had stayed up until midnight finishing the work in a state that was clearly inferior to the state she had been in when the phone rang. He had never asked about the report. Not that evening, not the next day, not in any conversation sense. Because the report existed in a part of her life that was entirely invisible to him, not because she was a private person by nature, but because she had spent 14 months presenting herself to him in the version that was most useful to his comfort. She had left out the part of herself that might have required something of him. She had made herself legible in the ways that served him and illegible in the ways that might have asked him to pay attention. She lay in the dark and looked at this honestly. It was not simply what he had done at the restaurant. The 8 words were their own specific damage, but they were not the whole of what she was sitting with. The harder thing was the accounting she had never done before tonight. The full record of all the moments where she had chosen, or told herself she was choosing, to make herself smaller. To ask for less. To simplify herself into the most convenient version and then believe, month by month and year by year, that the simplified version was her actual self. She had been an active participant in her own disappearing. This was not comfortable to see. It would have been far simpler to put all the weight on him, to say he was the one who had done this to her, and leave it at a clean conclusion. But Miriam had never been able to stay inside a simple story when the truer one was available, even when the truer one required her to hold herself accountable for things she would rather not have held. She had given him a version of herself that required nothing from him. And he had accepted it in the uncomplicated manner of a man handed something convenient who has no reason to examine where it came from. She got up at 3 and went back to the kitchen. She filled the kettle and stood at the window while the water heated and looked at the empty street below. The city was not quite asleep, never fully asleep. There were lights in windows across the way and the low sound of a car somewhere distant. She had always found something comforting in cities at this hour, in the way they continued doing what they do without asking anything of the person watching. She sat at the table. She got a piece of paper from the drawer. An ordinary piece, slightly creased from being folded at some earlier point. She had been rehearsing a letter to him in her own head for months. During the periods when something had settled wrong inside her and refused to smooth back over, she had practiced the shape of the honest conversation, the one where she explained what had been happening and asked him to understand. She had always postponed this rehearsal to a moment that was more right. A moment that never arrived because she had been making sure, without knowing she was making sure, that it never would. She picked up the pen. She wrote for a long time. She wrote about the proposals. All 5, with dates and specific details stored in her more accurately than anything he had ever written himself. She wrote about the October phone call. She wrote about Diane's birthday and the 3 other occasions she had rearranged her own plans around his without being asked and without any acknowledgement. She wrote about the meetings where she had softened her own contributions into questions and watched them travel through the room and return with other people's names on them. She wrote about the laugh. The gradual quieting of it across the months, so incremental that she had not noticed it happening, the way a room gets darker when clouds move slowly and you do not realize until the light is almost gone. She wrote about Portugal. The 10 days of being entirely herself, in a city that knew nothing about her and required nothing specific of her. She had felt, on that trip, the particular lightness of a person who is not managing anything. She had come home and stepped back into the careful arrangement of herself inside his world and had not seen, not until this moment at this kitchen table at this hour, that the lightness and the arrangements were incompatible. That you could not be fully present in your own life and also spend the majority of your available energy being the right shape for someone else's comfort. She wrote until she had written everything she needed to write. Then she looked at what she had written. She turned the paper over. On the back, she wrote 7 sentences. These were for him. Not for herself, not for later, but for him, clear and without anger, the kind of writing that comes when you have finally stopped trying to find the correct tone and simply say the true thing. The last sentence was, "I am not leaving because you are a bad person. I am leaving because I have stayed too long in rooms where no one remembers I am there, and I have finally run out of reasons to keep doing that to myself." She folded the paper once. She set it on the table. She sat with the decision for a long time in the still kitchen. It was not a light feeling. It did not feel like liberation, not yet, not the clean dramatic release that stories sometimes assign to moments like this one. It was heavy and real. a weight she would have to carry for a while before it became lighter. A stone sitting solidly in the center of her chest. But beneath it, something she had not expected. Relief. Small and careful and not yet sure of itself. But present. The particular relief of a person who has been holding something very carefully for a very long time and has quietly, without ceremony, set it down. She looked at the folded paper on the table. She understood, sitting there in the early morning, that she did not need to deliver it. The 7 sentences had been for her, not for him. She had written them to make the decision real, to put it outside her own head where it could not be rearranged by doubt, and it had worked. The decision was real. The paper had served its purpose. She did not owe him the explanation. She did not need the conversation that would follow the delivery of it. She did not need to sit across from him and watch him either understand or fail to understand, and she did not need his response to become the new thing around which she organized herself. She picked up the paper. She put it in the recycling. She washed her mug and put it on the shelf where it lived. She went to her bedroom and lay down. She did not sleep immediately, but she rested, which was different and which was what she needed. She thought about the train in the morning. The window seat she always moved away from when the train filled up, always finding the aisle, always making it easier for whoever came next. She was going to sit in the window seat. She was going to stay in it. Outside, the city moved slowly into morning. She closed her eyes. She was going to be all right. Not immediately, not all at once, not without the difficulty that always accompanies choosing something real over something comfortable. But she was going to be all right. She could feel it as a fact, beneath all the heaviness, beneath the weight of the decision, small and firm and entirely her own. She held on to that and let the morning come. Darian called at 9:43 on Tuesday morning. Miriam was in a meeting. She saw his name appear on the screen of her phone, face up on the desk beside her notebook, and felt the reflex fire, the lean toward the door, the almost movement of excusing herself. 14 months of repeated behavior had put the habit deep into her body. It had time to form and prepare before her mind could intervene. But this time her mind caught up. She turned the phone face down on the desk. She turned her full attention back to her colleague, who had been mid-sentence and deserved a response that came from someone fully in the room. She gave that response. The meeting continued. She was entirely inside it. She did not call him back afterward. She went directly to her desk and opened the work she had been building for weeks, her own report, and she worked through the morning with a quality of concentration that had been becoming gradually more available to her since she had stopped spending the majority of her attention on someone else's requirements. The work was good. Clear and precise and built on thinking she had been doing for months, thinking conducted in the margins and the early mornings, in the spaces that had opened up when she stopped filling them with availability. At noon a message arrived. "Are you all right? I haven't heard from you." She looked at the shape of the sentence. The concern came first, genuine as far as it went, and then immediately after it the information about what he had not received. She recognized the grammar. She had been listening to it for 14 months. The language of someone checking whether a reliable supply has been interrupted, shaped into the form of concern because that was how it naturally presented in him, not dishonestly, simply naturally. She put the phone in her bag and went to lunch with Lucy. They sat at the sandwich place 2 streets from the office, and Lucy had a real problem she needed to think through out loud with someone who would give her a straight answer rather than a reassuring one. A project with a timeline that was not realistic and a manager she was not yet established enough to push back against without risk. She wanted to know whether to push back and how. Miriam listened to all of it first. Then she said, "Push back in writing so there is a record. Make it about the specific numbers and not about your feelings or your capacity. Keep the tone of someone who assumes the response will be reasonable because that tone makes it harder for the response to be unreasonable." Lucy wrote this down. She looked up and said, "You seem different today. Like all of you showed up." "I am working on that," Miriam said. Wednesday came. Darian called once, mid-morning, and left no message. The silence after it was interesting, the silence of a man who was accustomed to being answered and was not yet sure what to do with the absence of an answer. He would wait, she thought. He would wait because waiting was what you did when you expected a return. She did not return. On Thursday he sent a text that said something felt wrong between them and asked if they could talk. On Friday a longer message, more carefully written than most of his texts, that said he had gone over the evening in his head for days and could not find anything specific. That he missed her. That he genuinely did not understand what had happened. She read this more than once. Every word of it with full attention. She was not unmoved. She had loved him with real effort and real care, and the echo of that love was present in her when she read his words. She felt the echo and did not pretend it was not there. But beside the echo, something else, clearer and more solid. He had gone over the entire evening in his memory, day after day for the better part of a week, and he had not found anything specific. He had looked back at that whole night and come away from his own memory without locating the moment. He was telling the complete truth. He genuinely did not know. He had said 8 words at a table and driven her home talking about something else entirely and gone to sleep with no awareness at all that anything had shifted. This was the final and complete shape of the thing. Not cruelty. The total absence of any awareness that cruelty had been possible. He had looked at her at that dinner table and said nobody, and it had not occurred to him then or in any moment since that the word had weight. Because she had spent 14 months being so thoroughly without needs, so consistently easy, so reliably present without ever asking to be recognized as present, that he had stopped being able to imagine she had weight at all. She had made it very easy not to see her. And he had accepted the ease with the uncomplicated gratitude of someone who has been given something convenient and has never had a reason to look at where it came from. She was not going to explain this to him. She had thought about this carefully and arrived at it honestly rather than reaching for it as justification. The explanation was its own form of the same labor she had always performed, the work of making someone understand why they should have known what they did not know, and that work falls entirely on the person who does not benefit from the ignorance. She could hear herself doing it already, in her mind, the careful and patient and thorough explanation, delivered with more generosity than the situation required, received with the best available intentions and the least possible lasting change. She could see clearly where it would lead, because she had been on that road for 40 months. She was done walking it. She did not respond to the Friday message. She went to work. She went the following week and the week after. She moved through the rooms she moved through, and something was different in the way she moved through them, something she could feel before she could articulate. She sat in the chair at the head of the table in the Tuesday meeting because it was the practical chair and she had always walked past it to the seat further from the center of things. This time she walked to the center chair and sat down. Nobody commented. The meeting continued exactly as it would have continued. She contributed 4 things and all 4 were heard and built upon. She walked to work 2 mornings a week along the canal, which she had loved for years and had stopped doing when canal mornings had begun to conflict with being maximally available. She ordered what she actually wanted for lunch without first calculating what was easiest. She called Diane at 8 in the evening, which she had not done in months because 8 in the evening had been time she kept available in case it was needed, and Diane answered on the second ring the way she always did, and they talked for an hour, and the ease of it was something she had been missing for longer than she had known. "You sound like yourself," Diane said near the end of the call. "I am getting there," Miriam said. She met Nina's friends for drinks on a Thursday. There was a man named Charlie at the table, easy and genuinely curious in the way of someone who was comfortable with people without needing them to be any particular way. He asked where she had traveled and listened to the answers with actual interest in the specific things she said. She told him about Portugal. About getting lost one afternoon in a neighborhood she would never have found by following a plan. About how that afternoon had become the memory she returned to most from the whole trip. "That is the thing you go looking for," he said, "even though you cannot go looking for it directly." She took the train home in the dark and sat in the window seat and thought about this. She thought about how much of the past year she had spent attending to a map that was not her own. Following a route laid out by someone else's needs and calling it direction. She was learning to navigate again by her own sense of where she wanted to go. She kept the window seat every morning. She worked on the report before the day began, in the 40 minutes she had reclaimed. The work grew more precise with each week. She could feel the quality of it from the inside, not with vanity but with the honest recognition of someone doing the work they are capable of when they are not spending most of themselves on someone else. 3 months after the restaurant, on a cold and ordinary Tuesday morning, Miriam submitted the report. She had been developing it for 8 months, across mornings and margins and the evenings that were finally hers again. It was the most honest and most sustained work she had ever produced. Not the most technically complex thing she had done. The most her. Built from a quality of thinking that is available only to someone who is not spending the majority of their attention somewhere else. She submitted it at 9:15 and did not think about it again for the rest of the day. This was what you did with good work once you had done it. You released it. You trusted it to stand on its own. Helen called her into the office the following Monday. Helen was the kind of manager who had decided sometime in her career that unnecessary words were a waste of everyone's time and had operated accordingly ever since. She sat across from Miriam and said, without building toward it, without the careful tone of someone cushioning a point, "This is exceptional work." She let the sentence end there. Miriam said thank you. She let the recognition sit where it had been placed without redirecting it toward her process, her resources, her team, or anyone other than herself. She had been working on this. She had noticed that deflecting acknowledgement was the same unconscious motion as all the other erasure, the same reflexive reaching to make herself smaller than what was being offered. If she could not receive being seen, she was choosing not to be seen, and she was done with that choice. Helen described the new role being designed around exactly the kind of thinking the report demonstrated. Early stages. She wanted Miriam in the conversation about its shape. Miriam said she would think about it seriously. She meant something precise by seriously. She meant she would think about it without the old habit of arriving at reasons it would not work before she had finished arriving at reasons it would. Without the reflexive caution of someone who had spent years treating her own ambitions as things that needed permission before they could be held. She left Helen's office and stood in the corridor and breathed. She did not inflate the moment or perform it for anyone. She let it be exactly the size it was. She had done good work. She had been told so plainly by someone whose plain judgment was worth something. She had built it herself, from thinking she had done herself, in time she had reclaimed for herself. It belonged to no one else. She called Diane at lunch. Diane answered on the second ring. She told her everything. The report, the 8 months, Helen's office, the role. Diane was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then she said, "Say it out loud." "Say what?" "That you did it. Your own voice. Say it out loud." Miriam was sitting in the thin winter sun of the courtyard outside her building, cold and bright at the same time, and she said it clearly and without qualifying it. She said, "I did that. It was mine." Diane made a sound of pure satisfaction. "Good," Diane said. "Now keep doing that." Life did not clean itself up into something resolved after that. It never does. The days continued to be daily and complicated and sometimes long. There were mornings she woke early and felt the specific ache of the year behind her, the time spent small, the effort of all that careful management applied to someone who had never noticed it was being applied. There were evenings alone that lasted longer than she would have chosen. There were moments when the old habit surfaced, when she felt herself beginning to reach for the convenient shape, and she would notice it and choose differently. Not perfectly. Not all at once. But with increasing accuracy, week by week. She accepted the role. She moved to a different floor and spent the first month learning the rhythm of a room where her contributions were expected rather than offered hesitantly. She presented her ideas directly. She disagreed when she disagreed. She sat in the window seat on the train every single morning and she did not move when the train filled up. She went on the trip in the spring. 3 weeks, 2 countries, a loose plan and a genuine willingness to see what each day would produce. She walked through cities she had not been in and felt the specific ease of being unknown, of having no one's version of her to maintain. She ate alone at tables for one and was completely comfortable. She got lost one afternoon in a city she loved and found a neighborhood she would not have found by following a plan. It became the best memory of the entire journey. Charlie asked her for coffee in April. They met at a place by the canal on a Thursday afternoon and talked for nearly 2 hours. He asked about the trip and listened to the specific things she said, fully inside what she was telling him. She described the afternoon she had gotten lost. He said that was the thing you went looking for, even though you could not look for it directly. She laughed. Full volume. Entirely unheld. He laughed with her and the sound of it in the small afternoon cafe was easy and warm and not complicated at all. She took the train home and sat in the window seat and thought about how long it had been since an afternoon had felt that simple. Since she had been entirely herself in a room with someone and had that be enough. It had always been enough. She had simply stopped trusting that it was. On a Tuesday evening in May she was at her kitchen table reading a book she had been meaning to read for 2 years. The apartment was as she kept it, quiet and entirely hers. The plant on the windowsill had fully recovered and was green and steady, thriving in a way she had not been sure it would when she first brought it home. The shelf of books. The photograph of herself and Diane on the side table, both of them laughing in a Portuguese afternoon. Her phone lit up. Not Darian. She had not heard from Darian since February, when he had sent 2 words saying he hoped she was well. She had read them and set the phone down because she was in the middle of something that mattered to her and the message did not belong inside it. The message now was from Diane. A photograph of a narrow street in an old city, golden in the late afternoon. Under the photograph Diane had written only, "Look at this." Which meant also, "Look at me, alive inside this." Miriam smiled. She sent back a heart. She set the phone down and picked up her book. Outside, the May evening did what May evenings do in that city, moved through the light slowly, generous with the last of it, as though the day had decided it was not quite ready to end. She read until the light in the window changed and she needed to turn on the lamp. Then she kept reading. He had called her nobody important. She thought about these words now with a distance that had not been there on the night he said them, not in the car, not at the kitchen table. The distance that comes when something has been fully processed rather than simply set aside. She thought about them the way you think about something that happened to you and shaped you and is no longer happening. He had been wrong. She had known it the night he said it, in a place beneath all her arrangements with herself, some wordless and absolute place that no amount of careful management could entirely reach. She had known it at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning with a piece of paper and a pen. She had known it every morning since, in the window seat on the train, watching the city go past. She had not needed him to know it. She had not needed his correction or his understanding or the apology he might eventually arrive at. She had not needed any of it. She had needed only one thing. The thing she had finally given herself, not in a single night or a single decision, but in the daily and imperfect and patient work of choosing to be present in her own life. In every morning she got up early to work on something that was entirely hers. In every window seat she stayed in. In every full laugh she led before. In every meeting where she put her own name on her own thinking. She was still choosing. She would keep choosing. The choosing did not stop when you decided to do it. It just became a little more natural each time. The room where she lived was one she had built from everything that was actually hers. It held good light. It held the things she loved. It had space in it for people who could see her without her having to make herself smaller first. She was in it. Completely in it. No adjustments. No arrangements. She turned a page. She was, and had always been, somebody important. She had simply, finally, after a very long time, stopped waiting for someone else to be the one to say so. It turned out she had never needed them to. She thought about all the other evenings like this one. The dozens of evenings across 14 months that had followed the same template. Arriving at an event that mattered to him, wearing something she had chosen because she thought he would like it rather than because she liked it. Sitting beside him while he filled the room. Watching him work his particular skill of being himself in public, the warmth and the ease and the way he moved through other people as though they existed to be impressed and were grateful for the opportunity. She had been proud, in the early months, to be with him. There had been a feeling she had carried into rooms on his arm, something she had not fully named but which was something like being seen by association. As though his visibility made her visible too, by proximity. She had spent so many years making herself small and quiet and useful that being near someone the room naturally oriented toward had felt like a kind of rest. Like being allowed to stop trying for a while. She understood now what that feeling had actually been. She had stopped trying for herself and started trying for him, and she had mistaken the transfer for rest because the effort was being spent on someone else rather than herself. This had not been rest. It had been labor dressed in softer clothing. She thought about when she had last had a drive home from something that was about her. When she had last been the person whose evening was being reviewed, whose impressions were being asked for, whose experience of a room was the one being considered. The answer came before the question finished forming. She had been the passenger for a very long time. In rooms. In decisions. In the direction of her own attention. She had handed the steering to someone who had not realized he was holding it, and then been surprised when the road was always his. The highway lights kept passing. Even unsteady and indifferent. She thought about her mother. She did not often bring her mother into thinking about herself, because the comparison was too direct, too close to an accusation when what her mother had done was survive inside constraints that had not been of her own making. But tonight, at this hour, she let herself think about it honestly. Her mother had spent 30 years in a marriage where she was the engine of everything. She cooked and managed and remembered and anticipated and smoothed and followed up and organized and maintained. She had done all of this without complaint for so long that the complaining had stopped being an option, had stopped being imaginable, had been replaced by a kind of proud efficiency that allowed her to present her own accommodation as a choice. Miriam had watched this growing up and had absorbed it as a template without understanding what she was absorbing. She had vowed, in the direct and certain way of young women who believe their clarity is the same as change, that she would not do what her mother had done. That she would not be the invisible engine. That she would ask for what she needed. She had believed this vow for years. She had believed it right up until she had fallen for a man who made compression feel like generosity. Who made her smallness feel like care. She had given the old pattern a new name and it had reproduced itself in her own life as quietly and completely as if she had never tried to stop it. She thought about the first time she had felt something wrong and chosen not to name it. 3rd month, a Sunday morning. She had mentioned something she was reading and he had replied with a comment about something he was watching, and the conversation had moved to him without hesitation, without the question she had been waiting for, and she had felt a small and familiar disappointment and had set it down to her own expectations. She had been setting it down to her own expectations for 11 months since then. Calling her own noticing excessive. Telling herself she was asking too much, expecting too much, being too sensitive to ordinary tiredness. She had made herself doubt her own perception so gently and so consistently that the process had been invisible from inside it. She was done with that. Not in anger. In a clear-eyed and tired recognition of having done something for a long time that she was now going to stop. She thought about what she would tell Lucy, eventually. She thought about all the things she wished someone had told her at 24. How the difference between caring for someone and erasing yourself for them can look identical from the outside, and how long it can take to learn the difference from the inside. How the only test that matters is whether the caring leaves you more or less of the person you started as. She would tell her, when the time was right. Tonight was for herself. She sat in the kitchen until the dark in the window began to change. Then she got up and washed her mug and put it on the shelf where it lived and went to her bedroom and lay down in the growing morning and held the decision close and let herself rest. She thought, in the weeks that followed, about the word available. How it had become the organizing principle of the past 14 months. The invisible architecture beneath everything she had built her days around. Available in the evenings. Available for the phone calls. Available to reschedule and redirect and rearrange. Available to hold whatever fell and smooth over whatever roughed up. Available to be present for whatever the day produced that needed her presence. She had been available. Comprehensively and without pause. And she had called this love, and it had been love, the love was real. But available is not the same thing as sin. She had confused them. She had believed that if she made herself available enough, gave enough access, offered enough time and energy and attention, the being seen would follow as a natural consequence. It had not followed. Because being seen requires that the other person is oriented toward you specifically, curious about you as a specific and distinct person rather than as a presence that fills a useful role. He had not been oriented toward her. He had been oriented toward himself, in the way that many people are oriented toward themselves without knowing it, and she had moved through the space around him with such quiet accommodation that she had made it easy for him to remain exactly as he was. She had enabled this. Both things were true and not contradictory. She had enabled his blindness and she had suffered from it. She had participated in her own invisibility and she had been hurt by it. Understanding both did not require her to excuse him or condemn herself. It simply required her to see clearly so she could choose differently. Nina knocked on our office door one Tuesday at 4 in the afternoon and asked if Miriam wanted to join a few of them for drinks after work. The yes came out immediately, before any calculation. Clean and unhesitating. She felt the small unfamiliarity of it, the forgotten ease of agreeing to something she wanted without first checking whether it conflicted with being available elsewhere. At the bar she was easy and present. She laughed when things were funny without adjusting the volume. When someone asked what she had been reading, she told them and followed the conversation wherever it went. There was no one in the room whose mood she was tracking, no equilibrium she was maintaining. She was simply there. She had forgotten what it felt like to be in a room with no one to manage. It felt like walking without something strapped to her back that she had been walking with for so long she had forgotten it was there. She thought, in May, about what she had learned in the years since the restaurant. Not lessons in the clean abstract sense, not principles she could list. The learning had been more physical than that. More bodily. It had lived in small choices rather than in any single revelation. In the window seat on the train. In the chair at the head of the table. In calling people when she wanted to talk to them rather than when it was convenient for everyone else. In presenting her own ideas in meetings without treading them through someone else's sensibility first to soften them down to an acceptable size. In laughing at full volume when something was genuinely funny. The learning had also been in harder things. In sitting with the loneliness of evenings when the old arrangement of her life was gone and the new one had not yet fully filled the space. In not reaching for the familiar discomfort of smallness when smallness would have been easier than the uncertainty of what she was in the process of becoming. She had not reached for it. She thought about what Diane had said to her in February. She had mentioned the person she was trying to become and Diane had said, without hesitation, "You are not trying to become something. You are trying to stop hiding what you already are." She had been thinking about this for months. It changed the shape of the work. It was not the work of building from nothing. It was the work of removing what she had piled on top of herself, one careful addition at a time across years of being the right shape for other people, until she could see the original thing again. The person who had always been underneath. Loud and curious and capable of filling a room when she was given a room safe enough to fill. She was building that room. Day by day, in the ordinary choices. She was building it and living in it and getting better at recognizing when she was in it and when she was slipping back toward the edges of it. The edges still called to her sometimes. The habit of smallness is not broken in months. It is broken slowly, over years, in the repeated choosing. She kept choosing. Charlie sent a message in May asking about the outdoor music thing by the canal the following weekend. Something small, no pressure. She said yes immediately. She said she would like that. She put the phone down and picked up her book and read for another hour without thinking about it further. She thought, before she turned off the lamp for the night, about the word important. The specific word in the specific sentence. She had been carrying it for months the way you carry a stone in your shoe you have not yet stopped to remove. And she thought about how the word operates. How it is always relative. How it depends entirely on what you are measuring by and who is doing the measuring. He had measured by his own standards, in his own room, by his own accounting of what mattered. By those standards she had been correct, she was nobody important. She had been a background figure in the story he was telling himself. She had made herself a background figure, carefully and over time, and then been had to be seen as one. By her own standards, she was the most important person in the story. She was finally, at this late and necessary hour, starting to tell about herself. She turned off the lamp. The room went dark in the way of May nights when the sky holds its light longer than the room does. She lay in the comfortable dark and felt the shape of the life around her. The apartment. The morning coming. The weekend ahead. The work she would do. The corner walk. The coffee with Charlie on Saturday. The book she would finish. All of it hers. All of it chosen. All of it, finally, fully occupied. She closed her eyes. Outside, the city was doing what it always did. Moving through its own enormous life, indifferent and full of people making their own calculations about what they needed and what they were going to do about it. And Miriam, in her apartment, in her own chosen dark, was making hers. She had taken the long way to arrive here. But she had arrived. She was home.